in main section we are trying to discuss the United Nations Security Council reform. So we have to understand the background of it. So what happened? PM Modi on the sideline of the IBSA meeting, we have discussed the IBSA meeting, right, said that United Nations security reforms are no longer an option. अब option नहीं बचा, it is necessity, right, because things are changing and United Nations are becoming a toothless tiger. In order to make United Nations relevant, we will have to make a certain reforms which is resisted by the P5 countries. Now having said that, let us try to understand the context and basically relevance of this topic. So it will come into the GS paper 2, that is the international relation and the United Nations and bilateral multilateral diplomacy, right. Anyways, now before discussing about the United Nations security reforms, we will have to understand what is United Nations Security Council or what is United Nations itself, right. So United Nations was basically formed in 1945. You might be knowing, again those who are new, I am discussing it for those, right. As a backgrounder, it helps you to understand. So United Nations, when it was formed, 1945, just after the World War II, right. What is the purpose? To maintain international peace and security, right. And as of now, there are 193 member states in the United Nations, and core objective of the United Nations are to maintain peace and security and promote human rights, development and international law, like United Nations, basically there are international courts and all, right. And more organ, basically main organ as per the article 70 of United Nations charters are General Assembly, that we call GA, Security Council, that we will discussing, ECOSOC, right, Trusteeship Council and International Court of the Justice, ICJ, and there is a United Nations Secretariat, right, in which our Shashi Tharoor also worked, right, and it functions through peacekeeping, humanitarian aid, climate governance and global development framework, right. Now let us try to understand about the United Nations General Assembly. So it is a bigger council in which they deliberate, they do the policy making, and representative organ of the United Nations is the United Nations General Assembly, and all 193 member states are having the membership and they represent one vote in each, right, and each elected they elect non-permanent member of United Nations Security Council. So who elect non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council? The United Nations General Assembly, right, and other members of the ECOSOC and other United Nations bodies. Also they adopt the United Nations budget, right, which is exclusive power under article 17, right, which is only vested with the United Nations General Assembly, not the United Nations Security Council. Also they can discuss any international issue except those under active United Nations Security Council consideration, right. This is as per the United Nations Charter article 10 to 12. So any active issue they can discuss, right. And they meet annually in September. Recently it was conducted and our representatives were also there. You might have seen several diplomats. In case you are into the Indian foreign services, right, you might represent India into the basically United Nations Security Councils, right. Also most important is United Nations Security Council, which is very important, and that is our center plank of the discussion, and its primary responsibility is the international peace and the security, and which is mandated in article 24 of the United Nations Charter, right. Also it have 15 members, 5 members are permanent, we call it P5 members. The flags of P5 members are given in the background, right, and 10 members are non-permanent, which are elected for the 2-year terms from time to time, right. And basically permanent member carry the veto power with them. Veto means to forbid. Veto is Latin word which literally means to forbid someone, right, to forbid. Hope it is clear to you. And it is the United Nations Security Council which can basically authorize peacekeeping missions, right, sanctions, they can do the sanctions, they can use the force, right. Last time it was used in the Iran, right, by the United Nations Security Council, and decision requires 9 vote, right, in which 5 permanent members will have to concur, right. So what is the vote? For 9 out of the 15 member body, 9 member have to vote in the support, right, and out of the 9, 5 permanent member have to support any clause, any basically resolution to be adopted by the United Nations Security Council, right. And it is the only United Nations body whose decisions are legally binding, very important. Rest of the are not legally binding, it can have the moral impact or otherwise, but the basically decisions of the United Nations Security Councils are legally binding. That is why it is very important organization, right. In the past they have done very good, but of late they are criticized for their lack of reform and their lack of inaction. We have seen multiple cases, basically Russia Ukraine basically dispute was there, then there are South Korea North Korea disputes, India Pakistan issues. This is very bilateral issue, but again they are not able to do it, and there are other flashpoint in which they are not able to do anything at all, right. Now, what are the core issue pertaining to the United Nations, right? So, basically that is United Nations Security Council, not United Nations, right, because if there will be a reform in United Nations Security Council, reform will percolate to the United Nations in toto, right, which is becoming irrelevant nowadays. First is the United Nations Security Council remains structurally rooted in 1945 provisions, in which there are 15 members, 5 permanent member with the veto powers, and rest of the non-permanent members which have only vote in it, right. And since then the world has changed a lot from the 1945 till to today. The world has changed, literally changed, right. So, they need to represent the changing need of the world, and they should not be rooted in the history, right. And this gap generate persistent legitimacy and the effectiveness concern regarding the functioning of the United Nations. Also, broadly the reform in the United Nations faces 3 hard constraint. First is legal or constitutional hurdle, right, because as per the basically article 108, as per the article 108 of the United Nations Charter, right, any reform in United Nations Security Council require basically two-third vote from the General Assembly and consent of all 5 members, right, which makes very difficult to do any reform. In case we are able to garner the support in the United Nations General Assembly, that is the two-third majority, but even if one member basically denies, which is the case with the India, for the being the permanent member of the India, China always roadblocks our path, right, because of the veto power which is given under article 108, right. Second is the basically competing coalitions are there. For example, there are G4 countries, right, and there are United for Consensus countries, right, which resist any basically change into the United Nations Security Council, and these coffee clubs and so called clubs are basically shadowed by the country which do not like reform. For example, Pakistan, they always ban basically try to ban India's entry into the United Security Council because of this competitive coalition, right, and there is a political resistance from the P5 member itself to change that, dilute their influence, because if there will be more members in the basically permanent Security Council, the influence of all these 5 members will be reduced. That is why they are quite reluctant to reform, right. That is why United Nations reform is also facing largely 3 issues, right. Now, what is India's position? So, India is long standing reform claimant. For example, we are member of the G4 countries, right. We are quite active in L69 countries as well, and we are quite active in intergovernmental negotiations, right, which stopped last time in 2015, right. And we are also one of the largest contributor of the peacekeeping forces. We are one of the largest and most vibrant democracy of the world. We are supposed to have the one of the largest country by population size, and we basically represent the developing countries, right, the South-South cooperation. All these makes India as very fit candidate for the entry into the United Nations Security Council. However, having said this, since reform is quite complicated, all the time we are being blocked by one country or other country, plus somehow even the P5 countries are quite reluctant to initiate the reform, right. Now, let us try to understand the key challenges United Nations Security Council is facing in terms of the reform. We will try to discuss only 5 challenges because it is only for the examination purpose and we are not doing any research work, right. So, let us try to understand the challenges. First challenge is the legislative or constitutional hurdle. We have already seen that any change in composition of the United Nations Security Council needs consent from a 2/3 members of the General Assembly and all 5 P5 members, which is never going to happen as of now, right. Why? Because ultimately it will impact their influence. But is the case reform कभी हुआ ही नहीं, ऐसा नहीं है. Earlier reforms were made as well. For example, non-permanent members has been increased from 11 to 15, right. The total strength of the United Nations Security Council has been increased from the 11 to 15 in the past. When it happened? 1963-65, right. 63-65, right. Earlier used to be the 11. By this amendment, we have done it to the 15 members, right. And accordingly, what happens also, somehow there is a intergovernmental negotiations active since 2000, right. They are also trying to push the reform, but this change was done with the consent of the P5 countries, which is not basically looking the situation of the world politics is not conducive, because many countries are having conflicting views in them. So, any change in this aspect seems not immediately not possible. Let us hope for the future world, right. Now, what we can do it, right. So, what India can do it, or like-minded countries like India can do it. So, we have seen there is article 108, right. So, let us try to work in this direction only, right. We can have short term working mechanism and long term mechanism to improve the situation. So, what is the short term working method? It requires General Assembly consent, right, and the consensus of Security Council practice changes, right. Plus, once things are better, we can cater in the political clout of India to do the basically reform into the United Nations Security Council. That is the long term and short term claim, right. Now, what is the challenge number 2? It is the veto power. Veto power is the biggest challenge, which is hampering the reform into the Security Council of United Nations. Hence, United Nations Council become irrelevant over the period of time. What is it? So, basically veto power is given under article 27 of the United Nations Charter, right, which has reportedly blocked council action to major crisis, and there is a voluntary restraint initiative. For example, France Maximo political declaration and act code of conduct is there, which have gathered signatories but remain voluntary and partial, right. So, if we are basically working with these countries, we can improve the veto condition as well in the United Nations Councils, right. Now, what is the basically challenge number 3? So, there are competitive coalition, we have already discussed. There is a G4, right, and there are coffee clubs, right, United for Consensus, right, and there are African unions and all, right. They all demand certain kind of the basically representation into the, or they block the basically reform into the United Nations Security Councils. So, what we will to do? We will have to somehow bring in every institution on the same boat, right, and we have done it in the past as well. There are reform into the IMF of the World Bank in the past, which was done during the negotiations and the diplomacy, which can be done as of now as well, right, and we can work in this direction to make things better, right. Now, challenge number 4 is the perception versus performance, right. What is this? India is very active contributor to the United Nations mandate, right. For example, we have more than 20,000 security personnel deployed worldwide for the United Nations peacekeeping issues, but we have issues at our immediate neighbors, right. If and our opponents say that if you are not able to solve the problem of our immediate neighbors, how we will be able to solve the problem of the world? Hence, India need to work upon all these things, right. Next is the practical risk, that is the reform fatigue, slow IGN process and credibility gap. So, intergovernmental negotiations have run for a decade with the intermittent element of convergence, right, but no final outcome. General Assembly session produce paper but not binding change. The process has recognized element of convergence, but is stalled on categories, regional action allocation, vetoes, right, because long delay reduce normative urgency and encourages status quo actors to maintain privileges, right, and reform monument risk basically dissipating if expectation and sequences are not carefully managed, right. So, what is the solution to it? We need to introduce a project management approach to IGN, define time bound deliveries, pilot institutional changes, monitor scoreboard, and it will basically reduce the infinite negotiation and create tangible step to measure outcome of the progress, right. So, having said this, let us try to conclude how we can basically introduce the change in the United Nations Security Council. So, we will have to work on the short term, medium term and long term goals, right. What are the short term goals? So, we need to push for working method reform, for example, in the General Assembly resolution itself, that increases the transparency, create a public veto register and pilot RLS SPS modulated through GA resolution and Secretary General administrative pilots, right. India should publicly join or co-sponsor a veto transparency initiative as done on the France-Mexico model, right. What is the medium term goal? We will have to operationalize RLS and SPS pilot with regional caucus, for example, AU plus Asia and a GA mandated evaluation after 3-year trial. Pair with India's diplomatic offer or technical peacekeeping capacities to African partners to strengthen political support, right, and build a P5 trust via issue based coalition, for example, counter-terrorism, peacekeeping reforms and climate security, where P5 and India can cooperate. So, we need to cater the P5 members as well, right. And what is the long term goals in the immediate 3 or 10 years? So, we will have to sequence a formal charter amendment push only after a demonstrable pilot success and clear P5 conditional opts in, right. And we can use the 1965 precedent to craft ratification pathways and timetables, right. We are doing it, we have done it in the past, we can do it in the future as well. And we can prepare a dossier as well, which show the credential of India, basically contribution of India in the peacekeeping, buzzards, normative initiative, etc., which will improve the basically outreach of India into the United Nations Security Council, right. What are the limitation and caveats? So, basically the political position of the states, right, especially P5 states evolved, all recommendation assume continued diplomatic fluidity. The Article 108's legal constant immutable until P5 agrees to ratify. So, pragmatic non-charter routes are necessary in this term, and many academicians basically access normative initiative to slow to change state behavior, voluntary instrument, for example, veto restraint, create a reputational pressure, but cannot force P5 compliance. Therefore, combined normative approach with concrete initiative is needed in order to bring in the reform into the United Nations Security Council. And based on all this information, let us try to solve the question which says that despite repeated global call for democratization and restructuring, reform of the United Nations Security Council remain elusive, right. Critically analyze the major structural, political and procedural implements of United Nations reform. In this context, evaluate India's case for permanent membership and outline a realistic pathway for moving from reform agenda forward. You can write it in 250 words having 15 marks, right, since question is long, right, and it is very relevant as well. So, hope you will are enjoying the DNA. Thank you.